Welcome to Series 2, Episode 3 of the In Her Financial Shoes podcast. Welcome to the In Her Financial Shoes podcast with me, Catherine Morgan, founder of The Money Panel, helping you to get financially naked. Listen in each week where we talk about that taboo subject of money. Listen to brutally real-life stories, step into our guest shoes and be left feeling 100% confident and in control. Oh, and we hate financial jargon, so don't expect any here. Small steps, big wins, let's go. Hi, and welcome to the podcast. So continuing our theme around investing, today's episode is going to be focused specifically on how you can get started and a little bit about what Robo Advice means. Now, on this particular episode, I've decided to invite Melanie Palmer to the show. And Melanie Palmer is the Chief Marketing Officer for a company called Exo Investing. Now, I became known of Exo Investing quite recently when they were launching a campaign called Embrace Investing. And Embrace Investing was really about how they could encourage women to be thinking about investing. So Mel is going to be talking to me on this particular show about her own journey with investing and also from her experience of how does she get started. What kind of things that you should think about before getting started? So we're going to cover off some key themes and key questions that I get asked a lot about around should you be building an emergency fund? Should you be paying debts off before you start investing? What is a good amount to be starting with? And where is the best place to start on your journey? Now, in this episode as well, we talk quite a lot about Robo Advice and different types of Robo Advice propositions. We also touch upon some of Mel's own experience of bringing together her pensions through one of the Robo Advice companies called Pension Bee. And we also talked about something called ETFs, which are exchange traded funds. So we talk about the concept of ETFs, what the risks are that are involved and how you can diversify that risk by investing in funds rather than individual shares. We're also going to be talking a little bit about ethical investing, although we are saving that conversation for some future podcast episodes coming up in the next couple of weeks. It's a really big topic and definitely a trend at the moment where women are wanting to be actually giving back to the world and to, having some say-so, I guess, really, in terms of culture and environment and positive change and all of these kind of factors that influence the decisions that we're making about investing. I also just wanted to mention on this particular episode that a couple of times I mention about the investing course that I have available. And I've decided actually to offer a little bit of a discount on the investing course for this particular series, because I think that lots of the questions that are asked by my community about decisions about investing and for you listening to the podcast, if you're wanting to continue this journey and education about, really investing in yourself to understand the journey and how you can make better decisions to start investing, then I have put together a specific course, an online course called In Her Financial Shoes. And it is an investing course for beginners. And we talk through lots and lots of different factors for you to really go away feeling completely educated about things like active versus passive. What do you need to think about in terms of charges and costs with investments? How do you distinguish between ISAs and pension wrappers? What kind of companies could you be considering? All of these kind of questions that are commonly asked about investing are all answered inside this online course. Now, with the online course, you also get access to a private Facebook community where we're always kind of batting questions and holding each other accountable to actually making some decisions about starting that investing journey. So it gives you a really lovely community as well to go in and ask those questions that you don't need to be fearful about, being judged or, for other people to be having very similar questions to you as well. So if you're wanting to learn more about this particular online course, then I'll pop a link in the show notes and in the blog post. But I am going to be offering a special 25% discount. So the course is normally £397, which can also be split into 2 payments. But just for this particular series of the podcast, I'm going to be offering a special 25% discount. So that takes £100 off the cost, bring it to £297 for anybody everybody listening. If you would like to access that, then I'll pop a link again to the discount code in the show notes as well. So without further ado, a big warm welcome to Melanie. So a huge welcome to the show, Mel. Thanks so much for coming on today. How are you doing?
Really well, thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
You're very welcome. Very, very welcome. It's quite apt, I think, that we're talking about investing and sort of we're going to be talking about things like spreading risk and putting things in different baskets, having just had Easter and talking about Easter eggs and
my favourite redoing the term of diversification is eggs in many baskets.
One basket, exactly. Fantastic. So I have obviously done an introduction already to who you are, Mel, but in your own words, could you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the CMO at Exo Investing, which is an AI digital wealth manager. I've been kind of in the investing world for about 2 years now, so still kind of relatively new to it, but I've always been in financial services. So I did InsurTech before, I worked kind of American Express, but always, financial services marketing, and then kind of discovered this whole world of investing and how far we still have to go actually with it.
So have you been in the financial services literally from the day dot with your career, or did you start off somewhere else?
I have. Yeah. It's a bit of kind of random luck, I guess, actually. So I worked at a media agency in London when I started working about, I think, probably 6 or 7 years ago. And I was immediately put onto the American Express account. So that was the only one I worked on. I was straight into financial services and I've kind of never looked the other way, actually, since then.
Ah, fantastic. So, and did you always know that you wanted to work in finance?
No, I had absolutely no idea. When I went to uni, I did psychology because I really wanted to do something that kind of brought the science world with the art world together. I didn't kind of want to specialize in either. And for me, marketing is kind of the output of that. But, I genuinely think had I been put on a different account that my career would have gone in a completely different direction. But I'm so glad that it did go into finance. And actually, I think, both my brothers have ended up in financial services as well. So it's very kind of random that everybody in our family has done that.
Same here, actually. My sister is in banking. Her husband is in banking. My husband is in financial services. It's quite an incestuous place, isn't it?
Yeah.
So in terms of your experience then in financial services, tell me a little bit about your kind of earlier relationship with money, because this is an area that I find really fascinating in terms of how we are, how do we become financially educated? And obviously, if you're working in the financial services industry, obviously you're going to be exposed to lots of content and information and, all the kind of valuable education that can help you to make better financial decisions. But sort of growing up with money, I also think that there's a big influence that all of us have in our lives around, what relationship our parents had about money, for example, and how that impacted on our own kind of money mindset. What was your sort of experience growing up with money as a child?
Yeah, I grew up in a relatively privileged lifestyle. But what I do remember is, so my mum was a freelancer actually, so she didn't have a fixed kind of income, and my dad was a stay-at-home dad, so really all of the financial pressure was on her. And I remember when things weren't going so well, the strain that would cause. So she'd be working kind of 14-hour days to make sure that she could pay for our education. And when you can kind of see, I guess, the emotional impact of that, that's where my kind of relationship with money started to kind of go, hey, actually, I need to be in a situation where I don't need to worry about it. Otherwise, that's going to have a negative impact on my well-being. And I guess I kind of thought that abstractly as I was growing up. And at uni, I had a job and it was all fine. And I remember coming out of uni and I was in my overdraft and it took me, I think, 8 months to get out of my overdraft in London. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. I hated not being able to have control over what I wanted to do, to make the decisions that I wanted to make. And that's where now kind of, making sure that I've got enough of that emergency fund, making sure that I'm thinking about my future, making sure that I'm making the most of my money. I think that's really why I've enjoyed financial services so much, because I find it so fundamental to kind of my way of living.
And when you went through that particular stage then of coming out of university and being in your overdraft, and as you described there, you didn't like that feeling of being in that situation. Do you feel that you had the knowledge and the tools available to you to understand how to get out of the overdraft?
Not really. I think it's, especially when you're coming out of uni, and there's a lot of kind of peer pressure to do things and be going out. It's very, very hard to say no, particularly when you're younger. So, I would skimp on things like healthy food rather than skimping down on going out for a glass of wine. But I think that's a really good learning curve to go through. For me, I don't think that was the hardest bit. I think actually the hardest bit was when I started to kind of get myself in a situation where, I can live, I can pay my rent, I can do what I want to do. Like, what do I do next? Now that I've got a bit of money, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, that was the bit that I found really, really hard. And that's where I started getting interested in investing, actually. And I remember I went online and found a stock trading course. I mean, a super intense, very technical, very mathematical, just horrendous experience. I think I did about 3 weeks of the course, and I was like, this is not for me. And it completely put me off. And that's where my kind of drive to make sure people understand that, that's not the investing world. That's not what investing is. That's a subsection of it. And that actually, in general, investing can be a lot simpler than that. But we can kind of get, scared away because of kind of the jargon or the technical language that is used in quite a lot of different environments in the investing world.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's many people listening to this that are in that space where they kind of understand that they perhaps should be investing, but they're just really not sure what's the next step. How do they get more confident in really understanding what does this world look like? And I think you're right. There's a lot of, even if you look at the personal finance space with books, with investing, there's a lot of what I would kind of describe as kind of male-centered investing books. So the language is very status-driven and all about power and having independence. And whilst those things are important, I think for a woman, it can be quite scary to kind of read some of this stuff and think, well, that's not really how I feel about money, because we're not confident enough to make those decisions.
No, definitely. I completely agree. And I think, with that, where you're kind of hearing the technology doesn't really suit you, and then you start trying to do your research to kind of understand it, and then you just get stuck in this hole of, well, I don't understand that word, so I need to look up that word, and then I need to get that word, and then you go, oh no, this is too much. I can't do this, and I'm not confident in it. And I think that is where a lot of issues come, particularly for women, actually.
So where did you go so after that course kind of bombed and you did a couple of weeks of it and you was like, it's not for me. Where did you go from there?
So then, I completely stopped. I didn't do any investing at all. I kind of completely shied away from it. I was working at a startup at the time. So my first actual investment was investing in that startup. So having equity within it. And it's funny because now I look at it and I'm like, oh, that's actually a really, really risky strategy. I put all of my money that I had at that time and I put it in a startup that I might never access that money. So, that was another kind of learning curve for me. And then when the job came up at Exo, and I was like, oh, actually, this is my chance to really get to grips with this, really understand it, and actually help more people. Like, that's really what matters to me. I don't speak a lot about investing with my friends at all, and that's something that I want to get better at. I still feel like it's a massively kind of taboo topic. So I took the job at Exo, and now this has really kind of, I guess, lit my fire for, let's get more people to understand it's not that complicated and that it's doable. And I have really big concerns about the future, and the pension gap is a big worry. The gender pay gap is a big worry. So the earlier we can kind of get people engaging in the topic, I think is the better. But it's difficult, I think, because in today's world, we have lots of apps and we have lots of accessibility now for investing. And I think we've kind of jumped a step. So we've given everybody all these tools, and, you can go into free trade and you can buy stocks, and you've got Robo Advisors, kind of like we are. You've got kind of simpler ones like Nutmeg. But if you don't really understand what it's doing, I'm just not sure that's the best kind of approach for people. So that's kind of my next mission is let's get the level of knowledge up. Let's get the level of understanding up. And then all of these tools that we have will be so much more useful for people.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. And actually, let's break some of this down. So you mentioned in there about Robo Advice. So we've kind of gone from this big jump to nothing being available to actually now there's quite a few different Robo Advice propositions that are available for people to get started with investing. So what would be, for someone who's never heard of Robo Investing, could you just describe what Robo Investing actually is?
Yeah, sure. So in the general sense of, all of the ads that you might see on the tube to do with Nutmeg or Money Farm or Wealthify. So what they tend to do is they take ETF portfolios and they'll have kind of 5 predefined or maybe 30, however many versions of those portfolios. You go on, you give them an idea of what your risk appetite is. So that's kind of how much you're willing to lose when you kind of take your money out and those kind of questions. So you'll go through that and then it will say, okay, you're a risk level 4, so we'll put you into this portfolio. And that portfolio will be made up of a number of different funds. So this is all kind of the eggs in many baskets, not in just one. And then they'll manage them. So they might change how much money you have in each of those ETFs, maybe 3 times a year. So that's kind of the backside of robo investing.
And what is an ETF?
So an ETF is an exchange traded fund. And again, it's the way of diversifying your funds. So if you think about, I don't know if you do know Free Trade, but Free Trade is a stock trading app. So you can literally go onto there and you can put money in Apple. So you can buy a stock in Apple. It costs you quite a lot of money, but you can do it. And that means that all of your money's going to there. So if that all goes horribly wrong, which I'm not saying it will, I'm sure they've got a lot of money in the bank, that you're putting a lot of your money at risk. Whereas what an ETF does is do kind of a diversification of that. So you might have 20 different companies within a fund with your money spread across all of them with lots of other people. So if one of them doesn't work or reduces in value, you're not kind of risking a lot more of your money. So then what an ETF portfolio does is kind of a money in different baskets and then in different baskets again. So really spreading the risk as much as it possibly can. So if things do go wrong, you've still got the opportunity to make the most of your money.
And I think that's really important to understand, isn't it? We actually talked about this on last week's episode where coincidentally we did actually interview Wealthify, and we were talking about the concept of risk. What does risk actually mean? And when you break it down into that example that you've just given there about the difference between buying an Apple share, so you're investing all of your money in one company, versus investing it into a fund, typically, that pools a number of, thousands of different individual companies together with you and a whole load of other investors. That, you're talking about there potentially going from one great big Easter egg, if you like, to like thousands. You might have Cadbury's in there. You might have, I'm just trying to think of some chocolate brands now, Hotel Chocolat. You'll have potentially hundreds and thousands of different companies in there. So if one does, go into default, or one doesn't perform as it should or not as expected, then actually in reality, you're not really seeing that much impact on the overall value because it's one chocolate egg in a basket of lots of chocolate eggs. Yeah. And I think that's really important to understand, because for a lot of people, that word risk and that word investing, for women particularly, from the research that's been done around this, is that the concept is it's gambling. It's just throwing money on a horse and seeing what happens. Whereas in reality, if you're going in something like an exchange traded fund or an ETF, you're just buying stocks in lots of different organizations and lots of different companies that you're probably already investing in, because you're buying Apple products and you're buying Easter eggs, and you're buying products and things for your home, for example. And these companies are sitting on the stock market. So you're kind of indirectly investing in them already, really, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's kind of important to mention the idea of tracker funds as well, actually. So, you might not know that much about, what's going on in the healthcare industry or the technology sector, and not know, what ETFs to invest in, which again can be another kind of, another step that you need to take to be able to understand on the investing journey. But in terms of tracker funds, you can just track the best performing companies in the UK or the US or worldwide. So even if some of those companies drop out, your investment will get changed anyway. So you're basically just betting on the future of the world existing as it does today and continuing to improve and be more efficient.
Awesome. So you mentioned about Robo Advice. So what exactly? So Robo Advice, you're essentially answering some questions about what kind of risk could you tolerate. And actually, if you go on to some of the companies that you just mentioned there, they do have some quite fun little questionnaires on there, don't you, that you can answer.
Yeah.
And they'll say things like, well, if you put £10,000 in and the market went up, would you be prepared to see that 10,000 grow to 12,000? Would you be prepared to see it potentially drop to 8,000, for example? And you might say, yeah, that feels okay. And then they might ask you another question. Well, what happens if that 10 went up to 20, but then it could also go down to 5? You might be a bit like, well, actually, I'm not very comfortable with that sort of risk. Yeah. So they do kind of try and put you into like hypothetical situations about what could happen in the market, so that you can kind of sense check, well, this feels about right. I'd be happy with that. But actually, anything more than that is, I would be considered to be too high risk. And I think the thing to remember with investments as well is that you can swap, you can switch them around. So if you're a new investor, you could, for example, start off quite cautiously, couldn't you? Yeah. And then perhaps look to be a bit more ambitious as time goes by, as you become a little bit more attuned to, the types of risks that you're exposing yourself to, perhaps a year down the line. What are your thoughts around that, Mel?
Yeah, I think everybody needs to go on their own kind of investing journey. To be honest, I don't think you can make all of the right decisions all of the time. It's not possible. You don't know what's going to happen. I know that I've, learned a lot of lessons on the way. I got sucked into the crypto craze, and I was adding money into that one. And, that was the first time I'd seen my money, almost disappear. And that was a big kind of learning curve for me. And I'm really glad that I did it, because now I've kind of learned the concept of, stock trading, for example. And I learned it not with thousands of pounds, but with hundreds of pounds. And I think the same kind of thing happens. So I have an ETF portfolio with Exo. And when the market started dropping before Christmas, I panicked, and I think my risk level was 8, and I was like, put it down to 1. I'm freaking out. Everything's going to crash. It was the worst decision I could have made. It was extremely impulsive. It was extremely emotional. And, I probably, even though I don't know that much about investing, I probably know more than most. And I still make, really big kind of rash decisions like that. So, there's part of me that's like, get started. But the other part of me is like, if you make mistakes, it's okay. Just make sure it's on the small amounts, not the big ones. So get started. If you're happy saying, yep, my risk level is 2. And they go, but if you're saving for a pension, it needs to be 10, and you don't feel comfortable doing that, do what you feel comfortable with. And it might be in the year that you go, okay, now I understand this more. Now I'm ready. But I just think it's a really personal experience, and you have to kind of go through the motions to kind of almost practically understand the principles of investing.
Yeah, and I think that's really that's great of you to explain about your personal journey, because I think that what you're referring to is that emotional relationship with money, isn't it? And actually, the stock market's going down, so you have that fear of, oh my gosh, I don't want this money to go down. And it's one of the reasons why I find behavioural finance so fascinating. We've actually got some guests coming on the podcast later in this series to talk specifically about some of the decisions that we make based around our emotional decisions about money. Because that's very brave of you to say that, because it is very true that often it is the emotion that drives the decisions, which sometimes may not be the best decisions. And sometimes, I'm very much a believer in that you set up an investment and then you leave it alone. However long your time horizon is, you leave it alone, because actually we are all human. And if we allow the emotion to drive the decisions, then, there's lots of stats around this, how it can be very, it can have a massive negative impact on the overall performance of your investment if you start to try and tweak it. But actually, for female investors, we're actually very good at investing. There's a lot of research around the fact that although we are more emotionally driven, when we do make an investment decision, we do tend to stick to that decision far better than men would.
We're actually designed to be kind of really good investors. It's almost within us. We are a lot more, in general, and I'm slightly stereotyping, but we tend to be more risk averse. So long-term investment strategies are perfectly suited to who we are. It's just that we just have a very traditional industry that's been kind of very male dominated, that makes us potentially feel like it's not, but it is. It really is for us. And there's a massive opportunity for us us to make a lot more of our money and have a lot less money sat in cash and kind of being eaten away by inflation, and instead, really making sure that we're in a much better situation when it comes to retirement or having children or taking care of other people.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So on that concept then, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It is just, it's the getting started bit that people, we can really try and influence. How can people get started? So talk a little bit about Robo Advice. I would say Exo Investing is probably arguably one of the most exciting propositions on the market, I believe, because you kind of sit as a bit of a hybrid, don't you, between Robo Advice and somebody who's going to manage and give you advice specifically on that portfolio. How does Exo Investing's proposition differentiate between a kind of typical Robo Advice proposition?
Yeah, so we're much more, individualized. So what we do at Exo is we'll ask you kind of a very similar kind of questions in terms of your appetite for loss, and we'll assess your risk. But we'll create a portfolio that's individual to you. So dependent on what you're kind of looking for, what you're interested in, you can choose different sectors. If you don't want to, you can let AI do what it wants to do. And then the second part of that is that we manage it every day. So that's not to say that it's going to change every day, but it's that because we are an AI platform, we don't have any fund managers or investment committees or humans being involved in that decision making. And what that means is that we can essentially give an individual investment manager to every single person. And that kind of service really isn't something that you get until you're into kind of the hundreds of thousands of pounds and the millions. So this was really about giving access to more sophisticated investment management tools than could kind of be available before. And, technology has really been the reason why we can do that. So for us,
technology is amazing, isn't it? Technology's unlocked so much. I mean, I look at my phone now, and I think I must have about 8 different personal finance apps that I use frequently.
Oh, I know.
That wouldn't have been available even probably 3 or 4, 5 years ago. There's the advancement of tech has just enabled us it just brings that data closer to us to make some really great financial decisions, I believe.
Yeah. But then it's also a really funny one when it comes to investing. And this is kind of back to your point earlier where, if you're doing a long-term investment strategy, you really shouldn't be checking it every day. You'll drive yourself mad. So, you've got kind of that oxymoron, in fact, of yes, it's accessible and you can see everything, but is that really the best thing when it comes to investing? In terms of kind of our approach is more about smoothing the journey. So there's less of the kind of, oh my God moments, we kind of move you out of risky assets if things are looking a bit kind of volatile in the markets. And if things are looking pretty stable, then we'll move you into more risky ones so that you can see more for your return. So it's a much more kind of gentler process in that sense. So rather than, 3 specific changes per year, it's happening all of the time. Again, much more about the kind of the management of risk. So much more about the diversification, doing it all the time. And because of technology, it's something that we can do without charging kind of additional fees on top of what we already have. So you can get that service for the same level as you would get for kind of the more traditional robo-advisors.
That's great. What I love about your website as well is that you can go through that process. You can answer the risk questions. You can have a look at the kind of portfolio that you would want to create before you actually create it. So you could almost like test run what that might look like before you hit that button of, right, now I need to decide, am I going to put it under an ISA wrapper or not?
Yeah.
So I love that because I think it gives people some confidence to actually look at, well, what does this really look like? What does it mean before they actually get started?
Yeah. And as a platform, we have relatively high barriers to entry. So our minimum is £5,000. And we kind of see that as an important part of that kind of process of, go through that, see what you would get out of it, make sure you kind of feel comfortable, make sure you kind of understand what you're going through. Because, this is real kind of money. This is money that makes a difference. If you look at compounding and you put in £5,000 and you look at that in 30 years time, that suddenly becomes quite an impressive amount of money. And it should be something that is considered, it is important. And I think, again, for me, we're not the starting of your investment journey at Exo. You want to dip your toes in, you might want to put, £20 a month into a traditional robo and see how that goes, see how that feels. And then once you've kind of got that lump sum ready to kind of go, yeah, this is a long-term investment, I'm going to plonk it there and I'm not going to touch it for 5 years onwards, then that's kind of who we're there for.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll pop a link in the show notes actually to there's 2 websites that I commonly point people towards when they're looking at making that next step. For people, I know that for people who have done my online investing course, at the end of that, we do a video series actually about doing some comparisons between different robo advice companies. But there's also a company called Boring Money and another one called oh gosh, who are they called? Money to the Masses. And both of those websites have really great independent reviews about the different robo-advice companies that are on the market right now that you can get started with. And obviously we are interviewing some of the companies like yourselves on the podcast so that people can just really understand a little bit more about the propositions. Yeah. But I think that's a really great place for people to start, is actually having a look at those websites themselves, and then thinking about, which one of those feels right for them. And, there'll be a number of things to think about, things like costs and things that we're going to cover throughout this podcast series as well. But in terms of the investing journey, Mel, where would you say, what should somebody have in place before they start investing?
Yeah, have an emergency fund. So investing is not kind of, okay, you've paid out everything and you've got £200 left at the end of the month. Let's go and invest that. It's really not that. Investing is a long-term strategy. So we're actually working on a new kind of product at the moment, which we want to bring to market, which is much more about bringing that saving and investing journey together. So it's kind of start out with saving, have your emergency fund, cover everything that you need to cover, have your rainy day fund. And then once you've got that, then when you've got kind of, at least I would say, and some people might invest kind of £10, £20. I kind of think you should have at least £500 that you're ready to kind of put away and not kind of touch, to say, yes, okay, I'm ready, I can do this. And that's where, for me, investing kind of starts in the journey. Once you've got that money, I think it is the dip the toe in. You just have to try it. I find, from a female perspective, talking to other women really helps me. So when I'm looking to kind of make a decision, you never know if it's the right one. And that's the same if you've been in investing for 10 years or you've read your first kind of article. You really can't know what the right decision is. So you can speak to other people, you can, listen to podcasts like these, read articles, but at the end of the day, you're the person who's kind of got to go, yeah, okay, I will do that. And what's kind of an interesting way is I'm actually part of a book club with a company called Finimize, who do information on what's going on in the stock markets. And we hold each other accountable. So if you say, okay, I'm going to download an investment app and I'm going to put some money into it, and then you come back in a month and say, yes, I did it, that's great. That kind of sense of, just giving it a go and other people trying it as well, I think really helps with that barrier. But it really does need to come from you, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of discussion in my Facebook community around, I'm looking at this, or what do you think about this? And for anyone who's purchased my online course as well, we have a separate community where we talk specifically about investing. But I think there is definitely something to be, something in that, because I think just to talk to other women about their own decisions as well. And you can kind of ask questions, and in a safe environment where you don't feel like any question is silly. But I think that accountability piece is also really important, that if you're going to make that decision, is for someone to hold your hand and hold you accountable to that. And sometimes to do it with somebody who's perhaps in a similar situation can just be reassuring.
Yeah, just to know someone else is kind of in it with you, and if it goes wrong for somebody else as well, then it's fine. But I think there's kind of two sides to that. One is with the the way that I thought about investing before I came into it, and I did kind of see it as a gamble, and you had to do all of your research to get it right. That that kind of sense, you really kind of do need to make the right decision. But when it comes to, an ETF portfolio, particularly kind of tracker funds, you really don't. These are kind of tried and tested vehicles for investing that lots of people use. So you really don't need to be as afraid of them as kind of you might think you should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think going back to the emergency fund sort of discussion there as well. I mean, for me personally, I know there's a lot of debate around this, but for me personally, when I started my investing journey, I didn't have much of an emergency fund behind me. And in hindsight, I probably should have had a slightly bigger fund than I did. But I started my investing journey in my 20s and I was saving, I think, something like £100 a month. And I've talked about this quite a lot, actually. My relationship with money wasn't great in my 20s. I massively overspent. Even though I was investing, I massively overspent on clothes because I had really, really bad body confidence issues in my teens. And so I spent all of my money on clothes. Literally, I would earn, a decent salary. I was working in financial services. I was working in the Channel Islands at the time, so I was paying less tax, and I was getting regular bonuses, and everything that I earned, I just spent. And I got to the point in my mid-20s where we were moving house and I needed some money, so I ended up cashing in my investments. But I think for a lot of people, it's getting into that habit of saving a small amount of money. Having an emergency fund is really important because, if you are off work because you're sick, for example, or your circumstances change, or you start having a family and you want to have a little bucket of money available to you just in case, something crops up. I think it's really important to have an emergency fund behind you. And typically most people suggest that you should have somewhere between 3 and 6 months worth of monthly expenses held in a completely separate account. So with my account, I have my bank account with Starling Bank, and I have a little pot that I've created, and it's called my sinking fund. Well, it's not quite called that, actually. It's called my OSH something T funds. If something happens, I've got money available there. And I think that is really important for people to have, because the last thing you want to do is to start that investing journey like I did in my 20s. And then a few years later, you need some money and then you end up taking it all out again. And if the markets have come down.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's where you can start to kind of think about the risks. There's less risk of you being invested in the markets if you can leave that money undisturbed for a number of years than, and you didn't have an emergency fund, for example.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important. And the other question I also get commonly asked about, I don't know whether you've got any experience, Mel, around this, but what do people do when they have debts? So do they pay the debts off first or do they invest?
Yeah. I'm not an expert, and I'll just anecdotally, but from what I understand and kind of what I've read is don't pay off your student loan, I think, is what a lot of people say, because that's actually got a very low interest rate on, I think, and that you should definitely pay off any kind of credit card type debt before you start investing. That's kind of what I've heard. That's not financial advice, but yeah, that's my understanding of it anyway.
Yeah, and I think I would definitely agree with that. But what I would also say, I have a lot of clients where we would create like a little debt plan for them, and we'll be able to see when they'll be debt free by if they carry on, paying off X amount every month. But what sometimes happens is when somebody's in that situation and they're just paying debt after debt after debt after debt, is they don't feel like they're getting anywhere. And emotionally, that can be really hard. So I would also say for anybody who's in that situation, maybe just tap into one of these little apps like Plum, for example. So Plum, they have an investing service where you can just filter off like £1 a month or something really small, but it just gets you into the habit of investing. And I think it's the same with paying debt off, isn't it? If you get into the habit of doing it, it just becomes second nature. And I think that if you are in that situation of paying debt off every month and trying to clear that, I think that should definitely be somebody's priority.
Yeah, I think habits are so important when it comes to finances. And I actually think, direct debit has been my kind of best friend for the past, 4 years or so when it comes to saving and investing, because now I'm in a situation where I don't think about it. So I know that I'll get paid my salary at the end of the month, and I've got 4 or 5 direct debits that, I've got stuff going into my pension, I've got stuff that will go into investments, and our stuff that goes into my cash, into my house buying fund. fund, and that money I don't even think about it, and it's not really part of my paycheck to me anymore. But I remember at the start that being really hard. So seeing the money kind of go out, and I was like, oh God, I really kind of missed that. And then you kind of adjust, and then it kind of gets better. And I remember because I think I set up my Help to Buy ISA. I can't remember how many years ago now, but I set it up and it was really painful. And then suddenly, I looked at it 3 years later. I didn't know the login to it. Genuinely, I had no idea how much's in it. And suddenly there's some money there, and you go, "Oh, great!" And, as you say, the apps that automatically do it for you, where you don't need to think about it, are so valuable. I think, and again, that's where technology has really had a positive impact.
Yeah, I think looking back in my teenage years as well, growing up with money. So when I was working at the banks, when I was working at Abbey National in those days, we used to have these share save schemes, which don't tend to be in existence as much anymore as they used to. But my husband came home actually the other week saying that his organisation has just launched a share save scheme. And share save schemes are brilliant because you would just money would come out of your pay every month. You'd buy shares, and then you'd have the option to buy. To sell those shares in the future versus what you bought them for at the start. And so, but you had a guarantee on it that you'd never lose the money that you were saving. And share savings, I remember giving people advice at the time where they would be saving like £100 a month out of their salary. And then 3 or 5 years later, they'd have this bucket of money that they completely almost forgot about. And I just find that really fascinating when we talk about the concept of pensions. And I know we're going off topic a little bit here, but it's the word pensions frightens people, when in reality pensions is just your future bucket of money. Yeah. And if someone said to me about putting money away for my future and and potentially just forgetting about it and then thinking about it later, that's not quite so scary. But all of a sudden, when we start using the word pension, people are like, oh gosh, no, pensions are risky, and well, pensions are for when you're 80, and just I think the terminology.
Yeah, and I think it's also been very opaque up until now. I've always paid money into employee kind of contributions when I was in kind of larger organizations. I didn't even kind of know where that money was, what it was in, how it was doing, literally no idea. And I'm sure you kind of mentioned this past, but so I've just got Pension Bee and I've put my pensions into that. And for me, that's a great tool. So now I can see my pension, and not only that, I can put money into it whenever I want. And that's something which I've never kind of had control over before. And kind of, it's made me engage in it a lot more. Like I keep going onto pension calculators and just hoping for the numbers to work out better than they do every single time. And they don't. And
great.
It's scary, to go, oh, I need to save this much amount per month. And then when you're balancing that against what you're spending and, especially saving for a house as well, that's a really hard kind of balance to make as well. And I'm kind of in the throes of that at the moment, going, am I doing the right percentages, between each? And the answer is, you just don't really know. You just kind of go with your gut and kind of hope for the best on that. I don't think anybody can really tell you what feels right for you. But I certainly now that I've got access to it and I can see how much is in there, I go, okay, well, I know if I save this amount, this is what I'm probably coming out with. And I never kind of had that transparency before.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I'm very passionate about, financial planning for women. So financial planning is all about actually bringing all of that data together and actually mapping out what does that really look like in terms of when I want to start drawing on those benefits. What does that look like? What does it need to look like in order for me to sustain my lifestyle and do all the things I want to do? So and one of the ladies I coached this morning, actually, she had £160,000 worth of pensions that she hadn't even taken into account when she was kind of totting up her own numbers. And she's very, very good at totting up her own numbers. But she hadn't taken into account this £160,000 that was split between about 10 different pension pots. And when we looked at her net worth figure, she was like, wow, like I'd almost like 160 grand just appeared on her bottom line that she just hadn't accounted for. And then the next step we did is to actually look at, well, what does that actually mean? So what expenses are you going to have in retirement? And we mapped out some different scenarios, and she went off and looked at some flight costs and things for going out to China and doing all these things on her bucket list. And then we mapped out what that might cost her, and then we put it into her plan, and financially was able to show her that she would still have over £300,000 left when she's 100, and so she was able to sit back and think, great. So I now know that what I'm investing at the moment is going to be enough for my future. And obviously it's based on different variables and different hypothetical situations. But as good as you can get, we were able to give her the security and certainty that actually now I know exactly what that actually means. And I think that's really important part of the jigsaw puzzle, is to actually think about, am I saving enough? How much is enough? How much do I need to be putting away? But I think for
being this, there's something ahead and I don't really know what that looks like or what that
Yeah, it's kind of just getting a bit more specific about, well, what are you spending right now? What's your lifestyle right now? And when you get to the point at, I don't know, 60, 65 or later, what's going to happen? Because we don't just hit 65 and retire and do nothing. We hit maybe 55 and we think about, actually, I just want to work 3 days a week now. I'm a bit fed up of working 5 days, or I'm running my business and I want to outsource some of this and I want to be running 2 days a week in my business rather than 5. And it's really kind of mapping out and thinking about some specifics about that to help people think about how much they should be saving and how much they should be investing. But I think going back to this, the area of how do we get started? So Robo Advice is a great place to start. Looking at some of the apps that we've kind of both suggested and talked about as potential suggestions for people. Are there any other tips that you can give beginner investors, Mel, about practical tips as to what else can they do to start that journey?
It's tricky. I do genuinely kind of think the robos are the best place to start, to be honest, because of the kind of diversification angle, and it's very kind of low barrier. I think some you can invest from kind of £1. The other things you can do is really depends on how you see investing. So actually in the women's kind of group that I'm in, there were a few people who are like, okay, yes, I want to put £10-20 into a robo, where there's other people who really want to understand kind of how stocks work and they really want to go kind of down that level. So I think it's thinking about what kind of investor you kind of see yourself and what level that is. And I think it's then trying to cut out all of the noise. So if for you, it's kind of, I just want to get started and I don't want it to be complicated. Don't put pressure on yourself to understand how every single thing works, because there's a lot. You could do it for years and years, but you don't need to. That's why, the robo advisors exist as they do, to make that really simple and accessible. The other thing I would say is to think kind of deeply, I guess, about if you are using the robos, where is your money? I don't have any stats on this, but it's a question I ask myself quite a lot. If you went to everybody who's got money in a robo advisor and said, where's your money invested? How many people would be able to answer that question? So if you want to be kind of a conscious investor, I think, dig into that a bit more, not necessarily to get started, but if you've had your account for, 3 or 4 months, maybe start looking into it and saying, okay, I'm in 6 different ETFs. Now, what do they focus on? And I think we've got a lot of really interesting trends coming into investing at the moment. Obviously, women are getting a lot more engaged, and women are very interested in ethical investing as well. So this is kind of another area where you can see investing not as just money in a pot that does something, but money that has an impact. So if there are things that you care about or are passionate about, that's kind of a way into investing that makes it more interesting and accessible for you. And it's very kind of personal, which finance should be anyway. So that for me is, once you start putting the money in, start to think about where that money is as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And we picked this up on the last episode on the podcast as well, is that it's definitely a growing trend, particularly for female investors. And we are going to do a whole separate podcast on ethical investing. But you're quite right. Yeah, if you think of it as not just money for your future self, but money that's doing good. And for anybody who has never heard of ethical investing, if you think about the London stock market, there are going to be companies in there that are investing in arms manufacture, in tobacco companies, for example. And if you're somebody who is a very conscious investor, I like that concept, Mel, conscious investor. It's thinking about, do you want your money to be investing in those sorts of companies? And if the answer is no, then potentially being, in an ethical portfolio is something that you should definitely take a look at. And a lot of these robo companies, some of them do offer ethical portfolios and some of them don't. So that may be a good differentiator for you when you're looking at them, is do they offer ethical portfolios, if that's something that's important to you. And as I say, we will cover this in a later podcast episode in the next few weeks. But I think that's a really good point, is to think about investing in a way that's going to enable you to do good for the world and to help create and shift some of this, this terrible stuff that's going on at the moment with climate change. And
money is empowering, and consumers are a very influential force, particularly with where they put their money. So, it's not something that I've kind of got to grips with fully yet, and I haven't, changed any of my investing decisions yet. But I've met some people who have, and, you have to balance it against potentially, I think there are a few ethical investing platforms where the fees are probably higher, and potentially the returns aren't as much, but, you get the kind of emotional connection to, do you know what, I'm doing something and that matters. So there's definitely a balance there as well.
Yeah, sure. And I think as well that if that is an area that's important to you, being ethically invested isn't the only way that you can give back financially. So we had actually an earlier guest on the show a few weeks ago talking about philanthropy and how you can be giving back in other ways. So that could be, for example, paying money to charities, for example, could be your way of giving back to the world rather than necessarily being in an ethical portfolio. Yeah. But it's definitely an area to explore. And there is lots of information available about ethical investing. So again, that may be somewhere for people to start and have a look at. So just to finish off then, Mel, are there any particular apps that you're using right now, whether they're related to finances or not, that sort of help you in your life or your finances that you would want to share?
To be honest, it's actually one that I've already mentioned. The one that's had the biggest impact for me is PensionBee, genuinely. Having, I lost one of my pensions. I had no idea where it was, and now it's kind of appeared again, which is good news. So for me, that's been really important, and has, I think, already had a massive impact on me, kind of saving for my future. So yeah, that's my main go-to at the moment.
Fantastic. When you say that you lost one of your pensions, what do you mean?
Oh, that I had a pension and I didn't know really that it existed, how much money was in it, who it was with, like nothing. I knew nothing. It was from my first job in London, and I didn't really engage at all. So then I decided to go and find it. I can't remember what the stat is, but the number of lost pensions is huge. So I would definitely recommend going down that route and finding them.
And how did PensionBee help you to find that?
So you can give them kind of as much information as you have, or if it's not very much, they'll kind of go and do the legwork for you. One thing I will say is that some of the pension providers, the traditional ones, can make it quite difficult for you. But once it's in, it's worth all of the paperwork hassle that they make you go through.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I've just quickly checked while you were talking there. There's 400 million in unclaimed pension savings across the UK. That's on the gov.uk website, that stat there. I mean, the number of clients I speak to, and when you ask them about their pensions, they're like, well, they have a rough idea, or they might have a statement that's 10 years old. And sometimes that's the most frustrating part of the journey, isn't it? Is actually gathering together all of that information.
It is. It's. I think actually it took 6 months for me to do it. But it's one of those things, you go through that hassle, now, and now it's done and great. And now I know exactly where the money is, because, I didn't even know how much I was paying in fees either. So, the longer you leave it, the more you could potentially be paying in high fees that you don't need to be. So that's definitely, making the most of the money that you already have. Pensions is a good place to start.
Yeah, that's a fantastic tip. There is actually a website as well set up, with the pension tracing service. So if anybody is listening to this that has a pension that they're not sure its whereabouts, you can actually go in and put, for example, who the employer was, and you can get some information as to how you can trace that pension. But I think commonly what I find is that people move house or they get married and they don't update the pension provider, and then the pension provider's changed hands like 2 or 3 times, and that's that's typically when they tend to get lost, is that you've probably got some old paperwork somewhere, and that's a really good place to start.
It's in another box that your parents
gathering dust.
Yeah.
Probably never even been opened.
I think I found some of my letters and they hadn't been opened, and I was like, oh good, I was very aware of my finances and my 20s.
No, that's great. What about, have you got any particular books that have changed either how you deal with money or just anything to do with your career, and any particular book recommendations that have changed your life or had an impact?
So Unshakable is a really good one for me. It's by Tony Robbins, and that he's a very famous, he talks a lot on the subject.
Yes.
But he really, for me, solidified the things that I had read about and not fully understood. So I don't necessarily know how useful it is as a first-time book, but once you're starting to kind of understand the basic principle of investing, that's a really good one to go, yes, I understand this, or no, I don't. So I think that one is a big recommendation from me.
Fabulous. I'll pop a link to that in the show notes as well. Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mel. I really appreciate your time and also your, sharing some of your personal stories about your journey to investing. I think is really nice to hear, particularly from somebody who works in the financial space right now.
No worries. It was an absolute pleasure. Oh, and there's one thing I did want to mention actually is our campaign, Embrace Investing. If anybody's interested, I don't know if Catherine, you can put a link to it. But
yes.
It's really, I guess, almost a side project here at Exo that we really want to help women to understand how they do make really good investors, and that there's lots of women to look up to in the industry. So if you're interested, which is kind of a site, we do profiles on women, and there's kind of a quiz and things like that. But again, just trying to get people more engaged in the topic of conversation.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. And I've been involved with the project itself. So I would certainly, I have shared it on social media before actually, but I'll pop a note in the podcast notes as well, because it is such a lovely campaign. And I think that you're quite right. I think the more that we can talk about just how complicated the industry makes this. This isn't because we're stupid or we're not able to make decisions. It's just that the jargon and how complicated it is within the financial services industry doesn't make it easy for us to make decisions. And I think that's really important to recognise. So I love the Embrace Investing campaign because it really focuses on, just encouraging women to make that first step. Fantastic. Lovely. Great. Well, have a great rest of the week, Mel, and thank you again for your time.
No worries. Cheers, Catherine.
Thank you so much for listening to the show today. I hope you got a lot of value from that. And I think sometimes getting into the habit and just making that decision to get started is one of the hardest decisions to make, and I'm hoping that by the end of this particular series you'll have everything that you need armed and ready to go and make that decision to invest. But as always, if you do have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to join my free Facebook community, and also you can pop me an email across if you wish at hello@themoneypanel.co.uk. And finally, I just wanted to also say that if you are enjoying the podcast, I would really appreciate a review. The reviews are really important to me for two reasons. One, because it's lovely to get some feedback from you as to what you're enjoying. And also it helps my rankings to get the podcast out to more people, which is part of my overall mission and purpose to create confidence for people to think and behave differently about money. So I really appreciate that. Thank you very much for those of you who have already left a review, and I look forward to catching you up with, get my words up properly, catching up with you again next Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.